Welcome to Practical Shamanism. I'm Katie Weatherup. I'm a former engineer with 20 years of experience working as a shamanic practitioner, and I hope to help you to connect to your personal power and magic, and to support you in living a really good life that just keeps getting better. Thank you so much for joining me. One of the things that I find most useful in my shamanic practice has less to do with influencing the outer world and more to do with being able to work inside of myself with aspects and parts that aren't necessarily the frontal cortex of my brain, my thinking mind, my everyday stream of chatter. In modern society, a lot of us have been taught and gone through our culturization that makes us identify really heavily with our thinking mind and our personality and the actions. But one of the things that I find so often I'm working with clients is they've gotten into an adversarial relationship with some part of themselves. So there's a power struggle and a lack of trust, and one part will kind of get the reins for a while, and then there'll be this pendulum swing and they'll go the other way. A good example of this is over and under functioning. So somebody will overfunction, exhaust themselves, crash really hard, underfunction for a while, but then there's still this power struggle when, they've replenished the energy. They have, healed the burnout. They're on the other side of it, and they're still fighting, moving back into productivity because of all the ways that pushing past the point of exhaustion felt so bad. I was talking to a really good friend of mine. She's an incredibly gifted acupuncturist, and in the process of, supporting her child and being a single parent, she worked incredible number of hours and was really burnt out. So when she revamped her life and moved and was coming back around to thinking about starting up her practice, one of the things the guides really showed me in a conversation with her was that she really had to build trust with the part of her that was a hell no to living that experience again, that she could do this in moderation so that she could take a small step and, kind of that trust built that she was going to hold hands with both parts of herself. And as sometimes happens when I get really connected to the guides and on a roll, eventually she's like, "Okay, Katie, my cup is full. How about I fill your water bottle before you go?" She's like one of the sweetest humans I know. And it was adorable how she gently but firmly sent me on my way. Because, once I get those channels open, it can be a little bit hard to turn off. I have to remind myself to step away from podcasting, because once I finish one episode, there's another episode, in my mind that downloads. I've got all those pathways open, and often I have to, kind of hang up the connection with the guides and make myself step away, just based on the fact that my voice won't hold up to 4 hours of monologues. I wish I had the voice training to do that, but I have never been committed enough to sit down and train in that way. So I need to, again, have that balance between being really involved in something and then transitioning. And a really good cue that you might be at war with yourself or an argument with yourself is if you resist transition. So you resist going to bed at a reasonable hour. I'm naturally a night owl, but if I find myself fighting sleep when it wants to kick in, I'm like, okay, I'm, not in as integrated a place. So it can be from work to fun. It can be from fun to work, whatever the transition is that you're fighting, that's a clue that maybe one part is kind of gotten control and doesn't trust another part that creates balance naturally. In working with these parts, I sometimes think of it as parents who have siblings that are fairly close in age, and there are a lot of squabbles that, power struggles and arguments and fights that being a parent of siblings of similar age, that's involved, that's part of what comes up. And the solution can involve deals or balances of needs, but the solution is never give away the annoying younger sister to the circus, or something where either of the children ends up disenfranchised. There's a middle road, and having that wisdom internally where we're using our inner wise person to make space for all the parts that we have and providing them with adult supervision. And a lot of times we think of our fear needs adult supervision. And I would argue that based on being biologically human, yes, it is always good to watch that your instincts aren't really freaked out in the background. That's a part that I pay attention to. But even the parts of myself that I really like and enjoy need a measure of adult supervision. The archetype of the healer never gets bored supporting people, having deep conversations, but I need to have the life balance of downtime and going to bed on time rather than staying on the phone till all hours with someone who's going through something. There's a balance of the both and of all the aspects of my life, especially in the modern era where we don't specialize as much. A lot of us are living a spiritual life and a secular life where we're deeply connected, but also needing to, earn money and get our driver's license and pay our taxes and be in the infrastructure of the world. We're not behind ashram or monastery walls, doing this deep dive. It's a really interesting time, but it's also means we really need to have all of our chakras working and turned on and in balance. So for me, one of the ways that I use my shamanic skills a lot is being able to look at what's going on inside of me, being able to look, do I have a chakra that's blocked? Do I have some part of me that isn't in flow, that's, gotten disenfranchised? The thing about when we have our voice not being heard or being silenced, and there's something that we need badly enough that we can't just walk away. We can't pay the price of giving it up to keep the peace, but being direct isn't going to work. A lot of times humans go covert. There's a lot of kind of the big blustery, authority figure is bullying everyone, but then there'll be all this underhanded kind of sabotage. There are all these interesting power struggles that come out. And it's really useful to be able to spot these dynamics. The complexity of relating is seldom victim, perpetrator, rescuer, and not to make light of abuse being survived in any way. I'm not condoning badly behaved parents who are violent or other people, but you can look at some strategies that children have that are about, getting the most needs met in a really messed up situation. And some of that is to become very manipulative and go very covert. It's one of the ways that foster parents can have a hard time if they go in with a lot of naivete and a very good heart. They're like, oh, I'll just love this poor child that's been abused. And there's a lot of complexity that goes along with a child that has endured a lot of trauma that means that there's a lot more that's needed to have them kind of coming back into alignment than just providing a lot of love in a safe space where no one's being violent with you. So there's all this complexity. One of the things that I am very passionate about with and work with my clients is the strategies that were very effective and healthy and the most needs met possibility in a dysfunctional situation that you were growing up in aren't so functional for us as adults. So the kind of lying and manipulating can be a really functional strategy in a space where you would be punished for having your voice, but in healthy adult relationships doesn't do as well. So one of the things that I'm really committed to is knowing what other parts of me are up to if they're trying to meet a certain need so that they don't do it in a covert way. So when I was younger, I got sick a lot more often, and I had a lot of perfectionism and overachievement and type A personality, and my value is tied up with the results I'm producing. So I never felt like anything I accomplished or did was enough. I always had some performance improvement plan of it could be this much more. In fact, I'm in a much more balanced relationship with exercise now, but growing up it was something I really struggled to get enough of, especially when I was in my, 20s and early 30s. And there was a day when I, had a little bit of extra time for an appointment I'd allocated for traffic. There really wasn't traffic. So I was going for a walk in this beautiful view in San Diego over the cliffs. And as I was walking, I was evaluating all the ways that I was falling short of the exercise I thought I should be getting, the weightlifting I should be doing, and the more frequency. And I'm like, wow, no wonder I avoid exercise. I don't have the distraction. I wasn't listening to an audiobook then. I think it was a little bit before we had smartphones or I'd acquired one. And so I was like, wow, no wonder it feels awful, not only the, heart rate getting up if you haven't done it for a while, but also my self-talk is really negative in engaging with this. I'm thinking about all the ways I'm falling short. So of course I would have a strategy of wanting to avoid this. So for me in general, that know thyself is a really important core value. And I think that using our psychic abilities and our ability to pair it with systems that allow us to really see ourselves clearly is incredibly high value. Because if you're very, very psychic, you can end up projecting something onto someone and then reading your own energy and not being able to differentiate that it originally came from you. So this ability to see ourselves as clearly as possible, which is a lot harder. We get really good at spotting other people's stories. Like Byron Katie work, we can get good at knowing our own stories, but we get amazing at spotting someone else's story that might or might not be true. And she says over and over again, like, don't take this work and then go start, telling people that everything they're sharing is a story. Like, that's non-consensual. This is not the point of it. The point of it is to, to look at your own self. But when you can have that sort of unconditional friendliness and being able to see yourself clearly. And I do think that some form of facilitated inquiry with someone who can give you feedback is very powerful. A lot of us are healthy enough, we're healed, we don't need therapy, but it is super helpful to have someone else who can see our blind spots and help us know when we start to rationalize something, because the human mind can rationalize anything, and having someone who can show us our blind spots is really helpful. So in my life, I've been playing with a particular use. If you've been listening to my stuff for a while, you'll know that I use my shamanic ability a lot to track my fight or flight system and to stay aware of what it's doing and to intervene with it when it gets spun out. And I was somebody who was in chronic stress state, very, very, very anxious and tense growing up as a child. I had like a chronic acid reflux experience. I dissociated because I was so overwhelmed and overstimulated. And now it's common for my fight or flight to be calm, so much so that when I get the little spurt of adrenaline, I'm like, oh, wow, I really noticed that, because it's such an uncommon thing for that to spike. And I've done so much training myself to track that and pay attention to it, which is really great. My health is so much better. But, growing up, I used to, as I said, I would get so overwhelmed, I would push, and then I would get sick, and that gave me the downtime I desperately needed. But it wasn't in the most elegant way. So we get these kind of side benefits from situations that most of us genuinely don't want. There's a upside of, okay, I can give myself time off if I'm sick, where I couldn't just proactively, because it's a wise thing to live a balanced life. And when I dialed in getting better at that, I think it's an ongoing thing to, take the downtime you need when you're an inspired entrepreneur, but nonetheless, ongoing work in progress. I didn't need to have something happen with my body, so I didn't have this, benefit, this fringe benefit to something like illness, which is just really interesting. If you find yourself unpacking something like that, like what are the side benefits? What are the, other things that I might get out of something? It's really good to be very, very gentle with yourself. But part of this kind of using your awareness, you can start to find parts of you that may have gone covert, that may have not been able to be heard directly, like, hey, I'm tired, I'd like to rest now, that end up, kind of meeting a need in a different way. And I'm just always fascinated by the complexity, the neuroscience, the biology that we have. I'm very interested in this question of thriving in a physical body while still having this incredibly dynamic spiritual and psychic nature. And it kind of means there aren't really off-the-shelf manuals, so I'm gathering wisdom from many different sources. So for me personally, the way this has shown up in a new way lately has been about looking at some of the research on chronic pain. So when I was 19 and 20, I had car accidents where I was rear-ended 3 times in less than a year. And the first one was a bad whiplash injury, and I was in a lot of pain, which was kind of a new experience in that way for me. And there was just a lot of really hard stuff going on. I was a kid who got homesick at summer camp, and here I was off at a university, on the other end of the state of California down in San Diego with an undergrad population that was bigger than the population of my hometown. It was this huge difference in experience. And my parents were going through some really fraught experiences. My younger sister was having a really tough time. There was just a lot going on in the Weather Up clan that was an exceptionally high stress moment. And so the people I was most connected to definitely didn't have bandwidth. They were just trying to keep their heads above water with their own stuff, wouldn't have necessarily known how to support me anyway. And I ran up against the insurance company that was basically telling me I was lying and all the complexity of that. And my strategies for staying safe were a lot of the good girl, respect authority figures. So it was very confusing and distressing. I was in a lot of ways a very emotionally immature 19-year-old to have someone accusing me of something that went so contrary to my self-image. So a lot of stuff going on. My grandmother passed in that time frame, and I ended up with chronic neck pain, and I treated with different chiropractors, and eventually, in my late 40s, I've got kind of a system of chiropractic care and heat and, some essential oils and a series of stretches I do. And, and it was bearable, but I'd still have kind of these regular headaches and soreness in the neck. And I'd, notice like, okay, my shoulders get tight. They pull on these little attachment places, and then I get a lot of neck pain and, so on and so forth. But I came across a podcast that I was really interested in. One of the people I really like as a podcaster is a man named Dr. Chatterjee. He has the Feel Better, Live More podcast. And this one was on chronic pain. And one of his guests was the author of Unlearn Your Pain. And they just had this really cool conversation about unpacking how there's so little correlation. There's some correlation, but in a lot of ways, there's not a correlation between what is actually physically happening in the body and the pain that's felt. The body can erase pain. If you're running across a field being chased by a lion and you twist your ankle, you probably won't even feel it. And I think we've all had times when we were involved in something that had a lot of intensity and we didn't realize that we were in a lot of pain. Or the brain can even make pain. And one of the things that really resonated for me was this notion of, I've been understanding that the tension in my neck that pulls on these small attachment muscles creates pain, but I can have muscle tenseness in other parts of my body in equally small muscles and not experience it as particularly meaningful discomfort. And it really was sort of an aha moment that at a moment where I couldn't process the emotional and psychological experience, my brain just got into this really bad habit of reproducing, pain, 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 pain. Okay, we're just going to have this thing happen. And that it was an outdated kind of neurological pathways that had formed that just kept firing and firing rather than something that's contemporary. And before I go further, I want to say that one of the things that this doctor and Dr. Chatterjee and everyone says is before you start exploring that you may have a pain experience that doesn't relate to tissue damage, it's super important to rule out injury or tissue damage. So it's not like we just assume that, it's something that our brain is making up. And the weird thing is the experiential sensation of pain, your brain is just kind of in a like, oh, this is the thing we do loop, feels exactly the same as pain that's induced by tissue damage. It's a really interesting thing. And there's kind of an engaging TED talk where the fellow talks about, surviving a snake bite and the different ways his body, registers pain related to that. So it's really fascinating. And my sister, she has her doctorate in physical therapy, and she's geeky about pain. And one of the things that she was talking about in what the research shows that I found through these podcasts and such is just educating people about the nature of our pain, physical pain, not being a one-for-one. And incidentally, this also applies to fatigue. Fatigue is kind of an algorithm that our brain says, oh, it would be helpful if I made you rest. So it'll make us feel tired, But going back to the pain thing, if you educate people in chronic pain about pain, there's a huge reduction for some people. It varies, but that intervention by itself can reduce the amount of chronic pain people are experiencing. So I got this book from the guest on the podcast show. I don't have his name in front of me. I apologize. This would be a much better podcast if I was like, it was by this person. But if you look up Unlearn Your Pain on Amazon or Google that, should pop up pretty quickly. But I only read the first part. I haven't even gotten to the exercises, but that's where the shamanic work comes in, where I could really find that I was having a habitual experience of some pretty severe chronic pain that wasn't tied to tissue damage or injury. And I started kind of using my shamanic work and the guides to say, hey, brain, let's get some neuroplasticity going. You really don't need to, be hurting like this. This is old. I did some just acknowledging of, what a little bundle of stress and fear and overwhelm and exhaustion and determination and lack of life skills I was at 19 and 20. I'm like, oh, thank goodness I'm not, 19 or 20 and I don't have to do that again. Like it was a hard time. And so tons of compassion for how this came to be. And, a lot of research about a number of different kinds of chronic pain conditions have a lot of correlation to adverse childhood experiences. So trauma survivors are way more likely to get this host of medical things. I think primarily that's because the fight or flight gets set to a high place if you didn't have enough safety as a child. And the good news is that is totally reversible. You can bring those levels down. I have a whole instinct intervention program on how to work with that because very, very important. And I use my shamanic work. I use my shamanic work to track and intervene with my fight or flight when it starts to spin out. So it doesn't have to be, something that you're stuck with, like, oh, adverse childhood, bummer, you're stuck with this forever. I'm all about let's clean this up and let's clean it up really efficiently so that you don't have to go on this multiple year healing journey. You could ideally get a soul retrieval, get the soul parts back, and do the instinct intervention work to drop the baseline of your fight or flight, which can happen very quickly if you put a lot of attention on being present with that. And then you'll start to see better health outcomes, psychological outcomes, emotional outcomes, spiritual outcomes. If you're wound up with the fight or flight, it's really hard to hear your guides. Like everything can get better really quickly. And as a former engineer, I'm super interested in how do we make everything get better really quickly. And so for my own journey, just this conversation with myself of learning some of the science, just a little tip of the iceberg about the science of pain, and questioning, like, oh, I can totally see why I have this chronic pain that is not proportional to what's actually happening in my physical neck. Sure, there's muscle tightness, totally willing to keep doing all of the things that I do to support that area of my body, but it just doesn't have to be hurting me at this level. There's nothing, so bad or so damaged about the area. It's just, some muscle tightness. So just starting to work with that and have that conversation and do the shamanic work and call in a team of guides to facilitate that. And that's one of the things I find really cool about shamanic work. You could do this with fire ceremony, you can do this with shamanic journey, you can use this with intention and focus, but there's an ability to go into something that I don't have volitional control over and say, hey, super complicated, amazing brain, I want you to go back to the drawing board and update this area of my brain that responds to a lot of stimulus with headaches and neck pain. Like, could we stop doing this, and seeing how much it responded. Now, one of the unforeseen challenges that I've had that's been, sort of fascinating, and gosh darn it, I've started having a lot more variety of sensation throughout the rest of my body. So if my hamstrings are tight or my IT band is tight, I'll feel that a lot more. Or if my low back is off, I'll start to feel that. I've had some very low level knee pain, and I've never had knee pain. And I don't think it's that I suddenly instantly became more rickety than I was before I started this journey, but I think in asking my body to update the information about pain to something contemporary, I'm getting feedback from my body that was previously shut down, which I think on the whole is a good thing. I'm having conversations with myself of like, gosh darn it, I can't just fling myself into exercise. I really do need to stretch before and after and warm up more than I've been doing. So I'm kind of in the process of retraining myself. But that fascinating thing where my body was so busy doing pain around this old pattern that just got really stuck that I wasn't actually even getting contemporary information of low level tightness and discomfort in my body. Again, nothing like super extreme, but I think I'm getting a lot more contemporary information, which has been a really interesting adjustment. So I just want to offer all of this. There are lots of different ways to go. You can go the really geeky route and listen to podcasts or get the book or work with it. And I think that that's really useful. Or there may be something else that you're working with where your outdated belief has you responding in a certain way. And we have a lot of systems that talk about how this shows up in our behavior patterns. Cognitive behavioral therapy is really a big deal. But I find that there's only so much of that that's useful. Like the research that I've read says cognitive behavioral therapy not super useful for resolving trauma. We have really great things like EMDR, NLP, somatic experiencing that are incredibly effective therapies for that kind of thing. So that sort of branching out and as well, and not only looking at like where are my behaviors that aren't as functional. One of the things, if somebody who generally I think wants to participate in the world with a lot of integrity tends to tell knee-jerk lies, I'm immediately saying, oh, this is probably someone who was punished harshly if they got the wrong answer in some way, whether it was, verbal displeasure or physical. Interesting aspect of how our brains work. A lot of the same circuitry lights up in our brain for physical pain as social rejection. So we have a similar kind of aversion to being rejected that we do to being physically hurt. So there's a lot of complexity, but this, ways of working with ourselves, I find really powerful. So I know this is a little bit all over the map, but again, I feel like a lot of times these spiritual practices are more about a result that we want. And ultimately, I find my results are a lot better. For all that I was wound into this tight little overachieving stress ball as a, young woman in my early 20s, I'm actually way more productive being in collaboration with myself instead of this adversarial relationship between the part of me that wanted to produce ever more results. There was never enough, and the part of me that was legit worn out by that. I look at my high school resume of everything I was up to, and I just feel tired thinking back to, I had goats that I was keeping alive, and I was all-star in 4-H, and I was in the band, and I was in drama, and I was taking dance, and I was taking college classes because I ran out of high school classes in this little kind of agricultural town that, definitely wasn't oriented toward college prep. And I just look back and I'm like, oh, just seems exhausting. So this ability to work with parts of ourselves, whether we're going into the instincts and saying, hey, I hear you. I know you're freaked out. I know you have a good reason for being freaked out, but it's not actually connected to reality. Just chillax. You're okay. And starting to explore being able to do a little bit of the same thing with pain, of being able to go into my body and say, hey, I really get that you think that there's something horribly wrong. But my self-assessment is that this is just a little muscle tightness and we could chill. And I'm not having my work checked. I still have chiropractic care and things like that. So this isn't just kind of I was in a recent car accident and I'm imagining that I could talk myself out of tissue injury. But it is really interesting to be able to collaborate consciously with parts of ourselves that aren't within our volitional control. And I've definitely found that journey really, really interesting. And so I wanted to share this, and hopefully there's something in here that is applicable to your life. Thank you so much for joining me. To learn more about me and my work, please visit my website at handsoverheart.com. There you can join my mailing list for access to free bonus content in the members-only area. If you've enjoyed this, please consider subscribing and leaving a review. It would help me out a lot. Also, a special thank you to my patrons for your support. You offer me the time freedom to work on passion projects like this one. If you'd like to receive personal shamanic support from me and my team of guides, please consider joining my Patreon community. You'll find the link below. And again, thank you so much for listening. This is Katie Weatherup, wishing you wholeness and happiness.